Hey, well, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third week of CRISPRCon 2020. Welcome to any new participants tuning in for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who are returning from past sessions. My name is Franklin Hawley, and I'm the Program Director for Agriculture and Food here at the Keystone Policy Center, and I am really delighted to be introducing and moderating today's event. Keystone is a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy organization that has spent 45 years helping to bring diverse perspectives to bear on decision-making in food and agriculture, natural resources, health, education, energy, and more. And our mission is to inspire leaders to reach common ground. The Keystone Policy Center is based in Keystone, Colorado, on the lands of the Ute people, and I'm part of the team based in Washington, D.C., on land that was once occupied by the Nacotchtank people. And we are proud to help facilitate CRISPRCon's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. The mission of CRISPRCon is to create a unique forum of diverse voices across a variety of applications in health, agriculture, conservation, and more. CRISPRCon, as a reminder, is about conversation, not consensus. We aim to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal histories and other contexts relevant to decisions on gene editing technologies. 2020 is CRISPRCon's fourth year. In the virtual format, we have 10 webinars and 5 themes over 2 months, plus additional discussion through our participant-led ideas marketplace. Throughout the entire series, we have a broad-ranging lineup of speakers and topics. We know we can't hear from everyone, but we do hope that our lineup helps to demonstrate the diversity of voices and issues that are part of the conversation on gene editing. And this week's theme is Hope and Hype, which aims to unpack the great degree of speculation on the benefits and or the harms of gene editing, as well as how the technology, product development, and governance in one geography or sector might affect the global trajectory of gene editing as a whole. We're asking questions about what can be learned from missteps, slowdowns, and breakthroughs in different sectors and geographies. Earlier this week, in Tuesday's session, we explored how gene editing research and governance is progressing in China, as well as how these trends are affecting research and governance in the rest of the world. And today, we will focus on gene editing research and development in the agriculture sector and discuss what gene editing products have come to market or are likely to arrive soon, how potential societal benefits have been prioritized, if at all, within that research, and how those benefits can be assessed. We want to thank our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPRCon and our ability to create these important conversations. Sponsors for the overall CRISPRCon virtual program are Corteva and United Soybean Board. Additional sponsors for today's session are Bayer Crop Science, Illinois Soybean Association, and Genus PLC. Today's Ideas Marketplace discussions immediately following our panel are sponsored by Cornell Alliance for Science. And CRISPRCon is managed by Keystone Policy Center under a statement of independence and welcomes sponsorships from organizations, businesses, foundations, universities, NGOs, and others interested in supporting the CRISPRCon mission. You can always access additional information and past CRISPRCon content in our expo. And we hope that the dialogue today will bring out lots of lively discussion and debate among our panelists and our participants. If you're joining us via Hop-In, please use the stage chat to submit questions for the panelists at any time during the panel conversation. And those of you who are joining us via YouTube will be able to watch the whole session live, but unfortunately you won't be able to submit questions. And divergence and disagreement are welcome, but please be empathetic, curious, engaged, and respectful as you listen and share across various perspectives. Okay, at this time, I would like to invite the panelists to join me on stage. I'll ask each of them to share their audio and video as I begin to introduce them. So I'd like to welcome Chris Newman. Chris, if you can share your audio and video. Chris, let me give Chris just a minute. Chris is co-founder of Sylvan Aqua Farm, a vertically integrated employee-owned cooperative in Montrose, Virginia, of farms, nurseries, mills, processors, retail outlets, and wholesale distributors, and is also a member of the Chaptico Band of Piscataway Indians. Welcome, Chris. I'd also like to welcome Michael Doan. Michael, if you could click share audio video. Michael is the Global Managing Director for Sustainable Food and Water for the Nature Conservancy. having previously been the Director of Sustainable Business Solutions at Monsanto. And Michael also farms in Kansas. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Sure.
And we'll go now to Modesta Bugu. Modesta, if you can share your audio and video. Modesta is a fellow of the Cornell Alliance for Science, and she is a graduate student in horticulture, the Horticultural Sciences Department at the University of Florida. Before she moved to Florida, she was the program assistant for the Open Forum on Agricultural Biotechnology of the Nigeria chapter in Nigeria. Welcome, Modesta.
Thank you.
And finally, we are also joined by Leland Glenna. And Leland is the professor of rural sociology and science, technology, and society at Penn State University, where he focuses on the social and environmental impacts of agricultural science and technology, their role in policymaking, and the social and ethical implications of democratizing science and technology research. There are detailed bios of our speakers on the website, and there you'll also be able to learn more about them and throughout the course of today's conversation. So thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. I am deeply honored to be with you and moderating today's panel entitled Peering into the Ag Pipeline, What Gene-Edited Products Are Coming Soon and How Should Potential Societal Benefits Be Prioritized and Assessed. With that, we'll get started. So let me just say a couple of things as we dive in here. We have framed today's discussion around the agricultural pipeline, and there are plenty of convenings around the world and resources that are highlighting what is being researched currently. For example, the CGIAR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, is currently hosting a 5-week series right now on genome editing in ag. And some examples from the Gates Foundation Discovery portfolio include cassava resistant to bacterial blight or brown streak virus through epigenetic editing, maize resistant to lethal necrosis and African maize hybrids via gene editing, or rice resistant to bacterial blight through gene editing. And high oleic soybean oil is another example of something that's actually available on the market through calyx use of the talons enzyme. And many of you are also aware of the anti-browning mushroom coming out of Penn State. So in short, there are a few products out there. There are many potential products being researched that aim to, for instance, improve orphan crops, products that could better respond to climate change pressures, better nutrition outcomes, among others. And there's a lot going on that, that folks who are interested can dig into. This session, however, is not necessarily a catalog of those products, while we will give you some more examples. It's more about whether there's a potential for societal benefit of gene-edited products and how those products should be prioritized and assessed. But we do want to ground ourselves in what products are out there before we dive into deeply. So let's get to it. Let me go to the panelists, and I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves and how your work has intersected with gene editing. And maybe Modesta, would love to start with you.
Thanks, Franklin. My name is Modesta Bugu. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm currently a master's student in Horticultural Science Department, University of Florida. So I got my bachelor's degree in biochemistry department in the University of Nigeria, and I minored in plant biotechnology. So that was actually the first place that I got exposed to the conversation around the use of biotechnology in agriculture. So after my undergraduate program, I started working for a platform called OFAB Nigeria, Open Forum on Agricultural Biotechnology. And the program was to promote access to evidence-based decision in agricultural biotechnology. So we bring stakeholders together to have conversations around these tools and to help them make evidence-based decisions come up from those forums. So in 2015, I attended a fellowship that is based in Cornell University, the Cornell Alliance for Science program. And they promote, what we do is to promote access to innovation for smallholder farmers all over the world. So that was kind of also where I got to meet a lot of people, public and private sector researchers who are developing both crops that are involving biotechnology and gene editing technology. And I met a number of scientists who are developing crops using a variety of techniques. So my experience there at the Cornell Alliance for Science program also inspired me, encouraged me to apply for my master's program. And now I'm currently working with the Klee, with Dr. Harry Klee, and his research is focused on improving flavor in tomatoes. Every time I talk to people about my research, which is on improving flavor, there is always this aha, it's high time that we had the flavor in tomatoes improved. So it's really interesting, and my research involves the use of conventional breeding. But what is even more interesting about it is that there are tools like gene editing technology that has the potential to make this work faster and better, and even has an opportunity for young and upcoming scientists like me to contribute our quota to improving food security. So that is actually why I'm very excited and happy to be here to share my perspectives about this talk. So that is kind of my interface with gene editing technology.
Thanks, Modesta. And Michael, why don't we go to you to answer the same question? Tell us about a little bit more about yourself and how you intersect with gene editing.
Well, thank you, Franklin. It's nice to be with you and with this panel to discuss this issue. I work for an organization called the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy is a large, conservation NGO based in the U.S., but with programs in well over 70 countries around the world. It was started 70 years ago, so we've got a rich history of work on basically the land trust movement. We've now focused our priorities broader than that into issues like climate change and food systems, where I lead. A little bit about myself. I grew up on a family farm. In fact, I'm coming to you today from that family farm, our old farmhouse, and I'm out here harvesting soybeans and planting wheat with my family today once we get done with this call. And so I've got a pretty current understanding of the challenges that farmers and ranchers face to produce the food that we all depend on. It's not easy. There's everyday challenges with pests and diseases and the vagaries of weather. And so, it's clear that we need to have innovation, fully on board to help farmers and ranchers meet growing food demand. I trained as an economist. Hopefully you don't hold that against me as we go through this conversation, but it's given me a rich understanding that we face a lot of choices in terms of how we produce food, what the impact is for natural resources, future generations, their ability to meet their own needs. And so I think that's certainly a perspective I bring. And I also worked for a large agribusiness, as Franklin mentioned, for almost 17 years. I had a front row seat in what were some companion technologies, the first wave of transgenics that were introduced, and the benefits and the challenges that we witnessed through that era. And so hopefully I can bring that into the perspective today in the panel discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And Chris, as our other farmer, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Chris Newman. I'm the co-founder of Sylvan Aqua Farms. We are today a collective farm in the northern neck of Virginia, about an hour and a half south of Washington, D.C. So just banging on the door of the halls of power saying, look at me. Our journey started with, well, for me, I'm an engineer by trade, software engineer by trade. So I kind of quit the software industry and the tech industry because I didn't like getting yelled at for a living. 10 years was enough, and decided to try something else. So now I decided to start a business where I still get yelled at for a living, but at least I get to play outside. We ran kind of head first into the brick wall of family farming. Family farming is hard enough when you start out with a multi-generational farm, when you start out with land, when you start with money and assets and equipment and resources and people that know what they're doing. To come into farming from completely on the outside, having none of that information, none of those assets is almost an exercise in masochism. So a lot of what we're doing is in terms of vertically integrating, trying to control more of the food value chain, not just owning the farm and the land, but also owning the distributor and the markets and the processors and the mills, and sharing ownership among people. because farming, I think Michael will tell you, a lot of it isn't based on income and being able to sell your crops for more than you produce it for. That tends to be very, very difficult. So a lot of the value in farming is based on asset appreciation, land ownership, and your ability to have kind of a land that's an asset. So our story of farming is really us just kind of bumping along and realizing what farming actually is and what it isn't. And to that end, my experience with gene editing is zero. I haven't really come across it in my work, and I kind of hope not to, for a lot of reasons. And not that I think it's a bad thing. I'm not like an anti-gene editing guy or one of these guys that, you know, says GMOs are going to turn you into Frankenstein or whatever. Like I'm not that guy. But I do come at it with a kind of skeptical agnosticism. So I'm myself curious to learn a lot from everybody that's on this panel, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to have you. And Leland, would love to hear from you as well.
Sure. So thanks for having me, by the way. And I guess like the other panelists, I've grown up on a farm too in southeastern Minnesota, and perhaps recognizing the challenges, I decided to study agriculture rather than practice it. And so I became a rural sociologist, and I began researching on agricultural biotechnology, genetic engineering back in the early 2000s. Began studying some of the institutions that are doing the work, in particular large companies and universities, and how the research being done at these different research institutions affected the research outcomes and the kinds of crops that were being studied. I then served on the National Academies of Sciences task force that studied genetic engineering, experiences and prospects, genetic engineering experiences and prospects. And so, which really kind of is very similar to this, the task being raised today, basically sorting through the hope and hype that was explained during the emergence of genetic engineering. And now we have gene editing, which is emerging around some of the similar kind of hype and hope. So I think this is a good opportunity to start exploring some of the concrete possibilities for this technology.
Great. Thanks, Leland. And that actually takes us nicely into our next question. So let's dig in a little bit more to your all's perspectives and experiences. And Leland, let's just continue with you, since you brought up some of the work that you've done, especially recently, on some of these similar themes. And would love to hear from you in general, from all of you, about how you think about the potential for the benefit of gene edited products, or the potential of gene editing to deliver societal benefits, maybe contextualize broader with respect to ag innovation. And Leland, for you specifically, one of the, I think you mentioned the paper, and it's so new, but you do highlight some case studies and about what's actually coming out in the pipeline and what some of the benefits may be or may not be. And would love to hear you speak a little bit more about some of those case studies, and then you can touch on barriers and benefits, but we'll dig into that later in the session as well.
Sure. Yeah, working at a university like Penn State is really exciting because I collaborate with a lot of plant breeders and plant pathologists and so forth who are really doing this kind of research. And there's often a lot of talk about what's in the pipeline. Some of the things that we brought up in that article are things like aflatoxin resistance in peanuts, virus-resistant cassava, and on, and which is all exciting, but it's often helpful to remember that we heard a lot of these same claims about genetic engineering back in the early 90s and really until rather recently. But we ended up not getting all that much benefit in things like orphan crops and minor crops. We pretty much just saw this technology released in some of the major crops, corn, soybeans, canola, those kinds of crops. So part of my interest is trying to explain why that's happening. And I think a lot of it had to do with policymakers seeing genetic engineering as something that could be accomplished by the private sector, and therefore we didn't need to invest in public sector research anymore. And so basically over the last 20 years, we've seen a decline in public sector investment in agricultural research. And we see an increasing reliance on the private sector. And a colleague and I even did a research project on this to study what research was being done at universities. And we see a shift from more of the orphan and minor crops to doing research on major crops. Well, that's because a lot of the research funding is coming from the private sector, some of the larger companies. Now, I'm not saying that the private sector shouldn't be involved in this. What I am saying is that we're not going to see the kinds of investments in developing some of these promises in orphan crops like cassava or peanuts, which are beneficial to, I'm actually have a USAID grant right now where we're working with peanut growers in northern Ghana. We're not likely to see a private company invest in that kind of research because these are just small farmers with very little resources. Therefore, you need universities funded by governments to develop these kinds of technologies. And so I would say, the promises of these gene editing crops are kind of similar to the things we heard back in the 90s. There is potential. I'm actually very pro science in this process. However, we're not likely to see these great benefits until we see some investment in things like infrastructure, scientific research, and even agricultural extension.
Great, thanks, Leland. Helpful to dig into that. And you mentioned small farmers with few resources. And Modesta, I do want to go to you now and hear a little bit more on this same question about how you think about the potential for benefit of gene editing products, both from the perspective of Cornell, for example, the fellows program that you're a part of. There's a pretty optimistic view there, and hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, and also as as an African, what your perspective would be as a Nigerian.
Yeah, thank you, Franklin. So because most of my experiences have been based in Africa, I would want to speak to the African context more. So in Africa, the public sector research on gene editing, even the public and private sector research on gene editing is actually still evolving. But I think there is more potential for gene editing now than the ones that we were promised in the 90s. So there are so many crops that are actually under research for African-based crops that are under research, but I mean they are being done here in the US. We have, for example, the virus-resistant banana. We have also the gene-edited cassava against brown streak disease. We also have the cassava that is being improved to have low levels of cyanide, and so many things. Even maize that is resistant to fall armyworm. So these are some of the crops that are on the pipeline that are still undergoing research. But unlike what happened in the 90s during the era of biotechnology, I see that there is a lot of promise on what is going to happen this time with gene editing, and that has to do with the regulation and the involvement, the communication that has been done on it so far. So during the era during the 90s, during the biotechnology era, when it started happening, there was low level of awareness. There was not so many information that was put out there as to what the technology can do and and the potentials that it had. And that was a lot of things that affected policy in so many ways. But then with gene editing, we see a lot of African countries trying to even embrace this technology, even though that it's not been really, even though the African countries are not really directly involved yet. But then the scientists that have been developing these varieties are building capacities too for us. So there is actually more potentials for us now in terms of the level of awareness, in terms of policy making, in terms of involvement of public sector. It's actually going to be better than what it used to be in the 90s. And also, because it's faster and easier to use and adopt, it's going to potentially have less stigma than we had with biotechnology.
Thank you, Modesta. And Michael, I'd like to frame this question for you. You've mentioned your experience and background, and would love to hear from you on that. And having been kind of part of the development, pipeline, and also maybe some perspective on the benefits related to conservation, or potential for benefits related to conservation in the work you do now.
Sure, happy to do that. I think there is an important and useful comparison that's necessary to think about, what the first generation of transgenics, what the hype was and what that actually yielded, and then also to, kind of put that into the context of talking about gene editing and what it may provide. But there's also, some places where we ought to, make sure that it's clear that not all of this will transfer, I think, completely. Transgenics are a different technology platform. They are distinct in their approach scientifically. They are more complex to both develop and to regulate and commercialize. And so the cost of bringing those to market is, in fact, greater. And that, I think, has explained, at least in my way of thinking, quite a lot of the issues related to adoption patterns. There was wide adoption of transgenics or GMOs in a handful of crops in a handful of countries around the world, and that's because those were the places that effectively could afford the cost of the technology, and the benefits were large enough to bear that cost. I think one of the real distinguishing characteristics about gene editing and the various platforms that are being deployed to make some of these new products is hopefully that cost and application could be wider. It's already in the hands of more technology developers. It's being more uniformly adopted across universities, small companies, not only the large strategic companies in the space. And so I think, to me, that's a point of opportunity. Important, I think, to this whole issue, though, will be what kind of regulation does society think is appropriate for gene editing? And that's really a debate that's very contemporary right now. We've just seen the U.S. Move to reform its biotechnology regulations, and they're inclusive of gene editing. A number of reforms made there, and I won't try to unpack all of those. It would take far too long, but I think there's been some important changes there that we should all be paying attention to, and really asking the question, will it satisfy and attend to our need to see the benefits more uniformly applied, more accessible to more people, and especially smaller crops and specialty applications? And will we also have the necessary safeguards in place to really manage the unintended consequences? It's not logical to me to think that there won't be some unintended consequences. And so we will need to have some effective safeguards in place there. Last thing I would just say is, to your point, Franklin, as a conservation NGO, just to be really clear, we're not on track to meet a lot of the vital challenges that we have today on water quality, on freshwater management, on biodiversity, on climate change. And so that leads us to being open to where innovation can take us, not seeing it as a panacea, not seeing it as the only approach to attend to these issues, but also wanting to be open to the possibilities And I could, list a few things that I think are particularly exciting, some types of innovations that I think take us in this direction. But certainly, some of the work that's going on is inspiring, and I think we should all lean in and see how much potential that can unlock, relative to some of these big challenges we face.
Thanks, Michael. And Chris, I'd love to open the question up a little bit with respect to your perspective, to kind of speak about maybe how do you contextualize gene editing and ag innovation in general, from your perspective, and are there things about gene editing that excite you? Certainly, and your the skepticism that you have. How do you contextualize that from your vantage point?
I'll say that the only thing about gene editing that has ever actually excited me was somebody that gave a talk about how it could be used to bring back the American chestnut. That would be great. Beyond that, in terms of agricultural applications, I worry a lot about it. Michael mentioned biodiversity, and I think that's a big one, because for me, for indigenous people, biodiversity is a function of a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And when it comes to biodiversity, indigenous people around the world, in the global north and the global south, tend to be best at it. There's research that says indigenous people at this point are protecting something like in the high 70s or low 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity on this planet. And it's not being done through market-based agriculture. It's being done through managing ecosystems that happen to produce food on a fairly extensive scale. When it comes to gene editing, I worry about that kind of relationship being upset. I worry about who develops the technology and who owns the technology versus who uses it. Because that relationship between the developed world and the developing world, when it comes to agriculture, tends to be highly exploitive and violent and extractive. And I don't necessarily have the level of trust to say that that pattern won't repeat itself, even if the technology becomes cheaper, even if it becomes more available. Ultimately, it becomes about control. It becomes about agricultural paradigms in terms of how do you grow food. For me, the issue is with gene editing as a solution for agricultural problems, are we solving the right problem by targeting, say, individual blights or fungi or individual crops versus, and I hate this word personally, but more holistic kind of ideas around creating the types of balanced ecosystems that can be, I guess, more resilient to the challenges that we face, that we've never faced before, the climate heating at a rate that just hasn't really happened since we've been here, or at least since, I don't know, it's called the Anthropocene now for a reason. Things are changing at a rate that we're not necessarily prepared to deal with. But given the history of the relationship between people who develop both agricultural technology and agricultural markets, I'm extremely skeptical going to become, and I don't think this is something that maybe gene scientists, like I trust those people, I trust the science, I trust the scientists, I trust the people who are doing the work, but I don't trust the owners. I don't trust the stakeholders and the people who stand to benefit the most financially from this and from the technology that's being developed. Because that history is to see just new markets in Africa, new markets in Asia, new markets in South. All they see is dollar signs on people's heads sometimes. And I'd be real curious to know how we're not going to repeat that very, very predictable history again.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that takes us into the next part of our question to certainly, or the next part of our panel, to a question about how this is related to learnings or the context of sort of the past couple decades on GMOs, for example. And it has come up in past CRISPR-Con discussions and other related conversations about GMOs maybe not delivering on the promised societal benefits that were touted. And I'd love to dive into that with you all about why that was and how that can really inform the discussion of the prioritization of gene editing and gene edited products. And I'll just pose that. If Michael, if you look like you might want to respond, would love to hear from you on that, and then we'll hear from our other panelists as well.
Well, I think Chris has put his finger on the real issue here, which is, what is going to inspire the level of trust in these technologies and their applications that unlocks the potential. Because I think just like transgenics, the potential is large with gene editing. I mean, if you just do the fundamental analysis of how could you, better protect a plant against pests, or how could you improve nutrition, scientifically, both transgenics and gene editing appear to have some application. Again, not a panacea. And I think that's really important, especially in a panel like this when we're talking about hope and hype. These have to be seen as part of a broader toolbox. And that toolbox should be ever expanding around the way that we understand our natural world already works. And so, within that, if it's properly set in that context, certainly I feel like there's still room for this technology to have application. But the question comes down to trust. And, our food system is linked. It connects billions of consumers with millions to billions of farmers. So it's a vast system that is trying to navigate trust in every one of those transactions. And right now, trust overall in the food system is low. So you enter an issue like this into that system, and it's fraught. It's a challenge. So I think that just one idea here that I'd like to propose, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists, is I think for technology developers of gene editing, the bar is much higher than you think it is to earn trust. We have to be thinking in different paradigms around regulation, around stewardship, around building responses to a much broader array of stakeholders than what, say, the first generation of GMOs contemplated. And it's both informed by that experience, but also informed by what we understand builds trust in the food system. And so, that's where I would really point the opportunity is take the opportunity right now to learn from the GMO experience and build a much more sophisticated, nuanced approach to bringing these technologies forward that really puts the question of trust front and center.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Modesta. I was actually going to ask you to share with us.
Yeah, so from my personal perspective, I believe there is an apparent lesson that could be learned from the era of GMOs, and that is that there is no point debating whether modern technology tools like GMOs or gene editing could be helpful in agriculture. Yeah, the benefits are there and the potentials are very large. And we all know now that if we want to make agriculture sustainable, we need modern technologies. Climate change is affecting us in a lot of ways, and it's making most of our food go extinct. And if we want to be able to control some of the impacts that climate change is having in agriculture, going the way of modern technology is the best way to go. That said, I believe that the potentials for gene editing actually has more room to improve trust and to improve access and to create more access than it did for GMOs. I agree with what Michael said. And what happened during the era of GMOs was that the public spent a lot of time debating on whether this should be accepted or not. They debated on, the public had a lot of concerns, safety concerns, ethical concerns, and all that surrounding GMOs, and those were legit. But then we spent a lot of time focusing on that instead of focusing on what these tools could actually do to improve agriculture. And that was what hindered adoption, especially in most African countries. But now this trend is changing. At least in Nigeria, for example, it took about 8 years or so before they passed the bill that was going to regulate GMOs. In Uganda, this bill is still waiting on accent by the president. But then this trend is changing because we now see that most countries that have their biosafety bill are actually probably going to include the fact that it will not be regulated the way GMOs are I mean, if it does not have a transgenic in it, that is not going to be regulated. So the fact that there is now openness and there is now more dialogue about this, it's improving trust. Scientists are actually even more willing and interested to speak more about these tools and its benefits in agriculture. So I really think that the lessons that we've learned from GMOs is that we have gone past the phase where we debate on should we use this tool or not. Is now how do we use it safely to make sure that we have safe and improved food for everyone.
Thanks, Modesta. And Leland, I'd love to ask you if you could to comment on maybe a level deeper around how science and intellectual property and investments and governance hurdles have affected sort of what came to market and how, and whether gene editing can overcome any of those hurdles. And there was also a question from the audience that is somewhat related about how you think about the impact of the cost of the regulatory processes on industry and academic investments and future benefits through editing, if we could couple those together.
Yeah, that's helpful. So some of the comments about regulation, I think, are a little bit overstated. Our panel in the National Academy of Sciences, we looked into that. We found that regulations really aren't as costly as some of the discussion. People like to say, well, it's regulations that are killing us. But if you look at the way crops are developed and diffused, so let's say a company or a university comes up with a new crop technology, it still needs to be bred into the local varieties that people can use. And in the United States, we have an extensive experiment station through the land-grant universities that is able to do that. Whereas in many other countries, they don't have that capacity. So even though someone might develop the technology, someone still has to breed it into local varieties and make it available to people. So I had a project with graduate students from Guinea a number of years ago, and we found that even a simple hybrid technology like Nerica, which is new rice for Africa, it was introduced to Guinea in 2008, but because it was a hybrid technology, right, you need new seeds regularly to keep it going. And so in 2016, when we were doing our surveys with small farmers, they hadn't had new seed in over 8 years. It was because the extension system hadn't been invested in. The experiment stations were basically empty. These things don't, trust I can understand, and regulations do affect things. But if we think, to build on Chris's earlier point about the paradigmatic changes, this reductionistic mindset that, if we can just manipulate the genetic material, we can solve world problems. Well, there are a lot of other things that affect the way a crop grows. There's people here at Penn State studying microbiomes of the soil, of the roots, and so forth. That has not attracted the same level of research investment, or agroecology hasn't attracted the same level of research investment, that because we've got this hype around these little, if we can just tweak this gene, we can really make something happen. And so I think we need a broader perspective of how we achieve these things. Again, I'm very supportive of innovation, scientific research, and so forth, but we need to broaden our ideas of how that innovation happens. And intellectual property is an important dimension of that. In some of my own research, I find that intellectual property may constrain innovation as much as regulations, if not more. You may recall about a decade ago, a number of entomologists wrote a letter to the EPA saying that intellectual property constraints were preventing them from doing research on crops that were being held by some of the largest companies. Intellectual property was what enabled a lot of these companies to gain their market power, right? Just 15 years ago, there was 7 or 8 major ag biotech companies. Now there are 3. Right? There's just so, well, we could say BASF is a 4th, but they're so small in comparison to the 3 large ones. And those companies have market power. Now, to build on this, the regulations and making sure things are safe, if we look at weed resistance to glyphosate, I don't think it's a stretch to say that's a huge regulatory failure by the federal government. And we could probably say something about the emerging insect resistance to Bt crops too. This is a case where, you know, the federal government should have been regulating the use of these products so that resistance wouldn't emerge. And, you know, all the talk about tough regulations, well, the regulations weren't tough enough. I don't mean to undermine trust, but I'm trying to say that trust is earned in more ways than just encouraging people that these potential benefits might emerge. We need to demonstrate it through investment in public research. We need to demonstrate it through real regulations that are effective. And until that happens, I'm not sure how many benefits are going to emerge or how widely distributed they will be.
Yeah, and I'd kind of like to jump on something that Leland said and that Modesta said as well. Modesta echoed a problem that's happened in the United States where indigenous crops that people tended to depend on for their kind of food sovereignty have been disappearing over time. And the culprit isn't just ecological change. The culprit is the market. And the market is largely driven by the kind of forces we see that are driving gene editing and genetic modification, GMOs, Bt corn, all that stuff. You know, my dad, you know, the thing that I got drilled into my head when I was a kid was that my people, the traditional occupants of Southern Maryland, Washington, D.C., had diets that consisted of literally hundreds of species of plants. And at this point now we're down to maybe a dozen and a half. And all of that happened basically because our crops, our indigenous crops, our crops that were designed to sustain us as a people were outcompeted by things that went into the market. So the question is, with the development of these editing technologies and the kind of stuff that Leland has mentioned about, are we going to devote that technology toward things that aren't just kind of the big six, you know, the ones that just have global export value? You know, why would a seed company invest in that? You know, how much is the good PR worth, and is it worth enough? You know, I certainly believe that gene editing could honestly bring back a lot of things, could make a lot of things different, could make a lot of things easier, could help certain crops, including indigenous crops that I care a lot about, be more resistant to change that is coming and that is coming more quickly than traditional breeding could overcome. But will it, and why?
Well, and to that point, Chris, and maybe you can just continue with this, and I'd love to hear the other panelists as well. But so it sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, there may be ways for investment to not be a zero-sum game. But in the current context, from your perspective, it would seem that, you know, it may be close to that in terms of investment versus in gene editing versus, you know, more holistic or other, you know, more ecologically based and indigenous based approaches. But even so, is there a better way to navigate this, and what does that look like? You know, what's the I've heard you talk about, you know, decolonizing ag. What does that mean, and how does that play into the conversation we're having today?
Yeah, I mean, Leland kind of hit it a little bit when he talked earlier about the concern that gets raised when this whole movement is basically being driven by private enterprise. If there was more regulation, if governments were more involved, if there was more democracy in the process, and where there was more accountability to the public and to more different kinds of people, then yeah, that trust would be established, because those are the same vehicles that could say, hey, for every dollar that we're going to put into basic research for gene editing, maybe we should put $1 or maybe even $2 into unearthing ancestral foodways that have fed people for thousands of years, especially in this country, and have worked. Because a lot of those ancestral foodways have been deliberately set aside and buried and frankly have been tried to be destroyed. You know, my father was in a residential school for that reason. They deliberately tried to make him forget how to be Indian, every part of it, not just wearing eagle and heron feathers, but also how to plant a milpa properly. Like these were all things you were not allowed to do. You were supposed to forget. So there needs to be an investment in that side, in unearthing something that's not just science, because science does tend to have a very powerful but tunnel vision kind of view of how to solve problems. that doesn't make it useless. That doesn't make it inherently dangerous. There's plenty of potential, but there has to be balance, because it's not going to solve everything on its own, as exciting as it is. And I don't think most reasonable people, especially people on this panel, aren't saying that it's going to solve everything, but that tends to be how it gets marketed, to try to make it palatable to a public that is skeptical because of what we've seen with kind of the first wave of engineering.
Yeah,
Modesta, I'd love to hear from you.
yeah, I agree with Chris on the part that they are promoting it as something that will solve the whole problem. Meanwhile, that is not what it's supposed to be. So those tools are supposed to be like, there's a way to liken it as a tool in a breeder's toolbox. While we are advocating for the use of indigenous technology, I want to back up a little bit to what indigenous technology means in an African context. Indigenous farmers simply means a farmer who is using a hoe, carrying a hoe and tilling the soil manually and trying to, grow the crops manually by tilling the crop. It also means a farmer who kind of relies on, they grow a seed and they wait for it to harvest and they save the seeds and they plant it the next season. And the research on agriculture and how it has evolved over time has shown us a lot that growing saved seeds is no longer sufficient enough to handle the changes in climate. And we know that even without using some of these modern technologies, that there is still this impact of climate change, which is, affecting the productivity of crops over time. So the fact that you mentioned something about orphan crops, some of our orphan crops that are going extinct too, in as much as domestication have done its role in trying to make sure that these crops are still available, we cannot go against the fact, we cannot dispute the fact that there is still this problem of insects and droughts, which is, insects and diseases and droughts and all of these other challenges, which is also emerging as climate change evolves. So the idea is, while we are talking about using indigenous technology, that is actually not practicable for so many farmers, especially people in developing parts of the world. These farmers, the basic knowledge they have about indigenous agriculture is maybe tilling the soil, using safe seeds, spraying chemicals, exposing themselves to chemicals, using all of these chemicals on the open air, which we know that it's also bad for the environment and it's bad for their health. So what I'm trying to say is, while we advocate for the use of these indigenous tools, which is very okay, we also need to use all the other options. We cannot just rely on one alone. We need all the other options to come here, and everything is going to play a role in improving our food systems. To speak a little bit about what Leland said about capacity, this capacity is evolving all over the world. There is now this global involvement of scientists from all over the world to make sure that these tools are being developed and applied in the right way. So while capacity is a question in most developing countries, there is still an opportunity here for us to grow and to apply whatever is available to make sure that we are in time when trying to solve these issues of climate change. And also the fact that we already see that, in fact, there is also something even to speak to this. The coronavirus devastation, for example, it has changed a lot in the way that we see and do things. We now know that if we don't speed up to this fight of trying to produce enough food for more people, we might actually be caught unawares, like coronavirus, caught us unawares. So the point still remains that even while we are advocating for conservation, for the use of indigenous technology and all of those, we also need some of these tools that are very, very important that can help us do things in a faster way. Conventional breeding just takes a longer time to produce these things. And if we have to wait on that, we might not actually get to meet the demand of feeding more people by 2050.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I gotta push back a little bit on the characterization of indigenous tech. I cannot tell you how many modern agricultural techniques are mimicking what, especially in this country, indigenous people have done. Everything from seed drilling, like the way that we go around the farms now. Like when I was a kid, when I went to Virginia, you could rely on farmland being plowed up every single year. You always saw it. It It's basically plow and broadcast. Nowadays, you just can't find that because soil erosion has finally gotten to the point where it's costing farmers money, and people decided to invest in the machinery and the technology to drill seeds into the ground that hadn't been tilled, and where rubber stubble remains. Like, that is indigenous tech. Like, that's how we planted. That's how my great grandfathers planted corn, beets, and squash. You did not disturb the soil unless you absolutely had to. Things like contour planting were absolutely happening here before people realized that that's what could be used to prevent erosion and prevent soil loss, and stop farmers from losing their shirts in terms of their natural resources. Even things like rotational grazing, like that stuff is being done deliberately to mimic what hunters in Africa and what hunters on the high plains of North America have done. It wasn't an accident. These weren't just like savages chasing freaking big game across the plains and not realizing what was happening in the wake of that. Like, we understood what was happening. Controlled burns are indigenous tech. Like, all of these things that are being considered the huge promise of sustainable agriculture and ecological conservation down the road are absolutely coming from us. We are indigenous people. Our great-great-grandfathers were far more sophisticated and far more observant than we are often given credit for. And I think there isn't enough recognition of exactly how much modern technology needs those techniques. Again, I'm not arguing that genetic editing doesn't have a place and that it can't help. But this common idea that indigenous technology and even the indigenous way of looking at the world, like backing up from like just the technology of it, how to plant a seed, how to do a furrow, how to do whatever, just the idea of looking at the world as something other than a collection of resources to be turned into money or living is something that really needs to enter the heads of people who are developing these technologies, so that they're not just focused on market-based solutions that got us into this mess in the first place.
Well, I'd love to use that and move us along here and dive in a little bit more. Chris, you've given us a lot to think about in terms of what doing this better can look like. I'd love to hear from some of the others of you around, are there new and different expectations with respect to gene editing around societal benefits and how they should be prioritized, assessed, delivered with the technology? And we also got a question from the chat about speaking to animal agriculture. And Chris, you mentioned rotational grazing, but I'd love to, if you all have case studies or examples or thoughts on animal ag, to include that in your comments as well. And I'll just, if you'd like to pick it up, Leland, maybe you can start us off. I see you nodding your head.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Okay. I was just nodding my head because I was listening, but that's fine. Yeah. So animal agriculture, and this, the broader question seems to be, is it just a symptom of a larger ag system dynamic that might explain some of the consolidation in seed firms? That's a good point. In the United States, back in the early 1980s, the United States basically made a decision not to enforce anti-monopoly, anti-oligopoly laws. And so to a certain extent, this consolidation probably would have happened. And you see it in multiple sectors of agriculture, right? Machinery technology, it's a few companies now pretty much control that whole market. So you see consolidation in multiple sectors. Now, animal agriculture is interesting because that's just moving on a whole nother plane in some ways. So I happen to be on a large USDA grant with a couple of colleagues here at Penn State and then some others at other universities around the country. And we're studying lab meat. Right, so cellular. You take a biopsy of a cow or a pig or chicken, and you put it in a lab suspension or I can't even think of the technology. The use of the words right now are kind of escaping me. But you stimulate it and begins to grow meat in a laboratory setting, and some of those foods are just beginning to hit the market now. I believe there's some chicken you can buy for $50 a pound that's lab grown in San Francisco. So it's still kind of expensive, but we know how these things happen, right? So you do the proof of concept, and then it begins to become cheaper as the technology improves. It's possible that in the next several years, we'll see lab-grown meats become part of the. So in some ways, I don't see gene editing. Gene editing might be a part of that, but I see some other dynamics happening in the meat industry that might be more disruptive than any kind of gene editing. That's just my take on it. I mean, we could talk about some of the same things that are, yeah, I'll leave it to others to comment on that. But my perspective is that other technologies are emerging in meat production or in animal ag that might take it in a completely different direction.
Thanks, Leland. Anybody else want to add to that or respond?
Well, just a couple of things. I think, first of all, I think there's been several comments here about this question about how do we weigh out investments in gene editing versus other forms of improvement in agriculture that we could see. And I just want to be very clear. I think, there's an opportunity for a real paradigm shift over the next generation, how we produce food. And that is really understanding natural processes, understanding indigenous techniques to producing food, understanding that there are heritage techniques that we've somehow lost over time, and that we need to reclaim those. We need to reinforce what we know about how the soil works, about how broader landscapes can function better for the environment and better for human nutrition. And I think that starts with stuff that isn't what I would call high tech. It's really about understanding our natural world and looking for solutions first in the natural world. But I think that pursuit of understanding our natural world takes us back to understanding the science of gene editing as well. And so over time, I think we can see that there will be some complementary approaches here that could involve gene editing. Just one good example, I think, on animal agriculture is most of the applications that I see going on in animal agriculture aren't some huge step change in the way an animal performs or something like that. It's more just about using it as an additional selection and breeding technique in parent lines to gently and over time just make some nice changes to the parent line genetics that go into to the livestock. And so this could be to address a particular disease or something like that. And so there are subtle changes that can be done just in a way that I think could be complementary to all the things that we know need to be first priorities around returning to a form of agriculture that is much more aligned with natural processes.
Thanks, Michael. Chris, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I heard an animal. I'm like on the farm in my car, so sorry if that seemed like distracting, like moving around. Yeah, Michael made a point that I think really needs to be hit on, which is having an agriculture that is aligned with natural processes also means having an agriculture that is actually oriented toward feeding people first and making money second, and not the other way around. I feel like a lot of the relationship, if we're gonna talk about animal agriculture and gene editing and step back a little bit maybe toward GMOs, formed, a lot of our agriculture system, and I mean not even our agriculture, our food system, and what we do with food, and even taking products that are supposed to be food and turning them into other things like ethanol and bioplastics and whatever. Much of our food system is based on finding out what to do with all this freaking corn that we've got. We overproduce it on purpose every year, and we've especially been doing it since the Cold War, where food production and Earl Butzianism kind of got us planting fence row to fence row, basically to say F you to the Soviet Union, and we never stopped. So like every year we got to find something to do with this bumper crop of corn that's only gotten more and more big with GMOs. I mean, the yield got bigger. We got more bushels per acre. The county I'm in right now has the record for per acre corn production. I think it's something like 500 or 600 bushels per acre. Nobody in the world needs that much corn. Nobody, ever. Like, my kids don't need that much corn. They're full of energy. Like, stop. Like, we've got this system where now we produce all this corn, and now our livestock industry is dependent on it. It's why you can get ground beef for like $3 a pound at Costco. It's why we dump agricultural exports below the price of production in Africa, in Asia, all over the global south, all over the developing world. It's why we have ethanol that nobody wants. Nobody ever asked for ethanol. Like, nobody wants ethanol in their car. Ask any gearhead if they want ethanol in their car. They'll strangle you. Our whole food system is based on, we got too much corn. Good God, get rid of it. And we're never going to have an agricultural system that's in line with nature if we're doing production for unnatural reasons. If we're just finding a way for agribusiness to have a cheap input commodity that they can turn into money. And as long as gene editing breaks away from that paradigm, which so far it hasn't, it's going to be more of the same. And the one thing that I might be excited about is the fact that we're now all saying this out loud in a forum about gene editing, because I don't think this really happened that much before. I mean, I was probably a teenager when all this stuff was happening, so I don't know, maybe it did. But yeah, we need a real food system that's actually about food and not about money, and goes back again. I'm sorry to keep saying this. I know I'm kind of a pain in the butt saying this, but like, back to that indigenous ethic of food is for food sovereignty. It is for feeding your community. Food is for protecting your environment. It is for increasing biodiversity. It is for remembering that the soil underneath your feet is made out of the bodies of the ancestors that have come before you and needs to be regarded as holy. That's not going to happen under the wrong circumstances, where genetic engineering is not used as something that pairs with a non-market ethic. Like, we talked about, and Michael kind of brought this up about the blendings of technologies. Like, when I talked about like no-till and seed drilling, like, that is an appropriate merging of those technologies. Like, I can go out and buy a $70,000 seed drill and do things in a much better way because this thing was based on an indigenous ethic of not disturbing the soil, and the technology made it better. And I would love to see more technologies that make things like planting polycultures easy, and maybe genetic engineering can do something about the methane problem in cows. Like, I don't know, but that would be great.
Yeah, it's really amazing that Chris brought up this point about producing enough food. And, while it's something that we talk about here in the US, it's actually not what is obtainable in so many developing parts of the world. So we would definitely love to produce enough food. And even when we talk about this, the discourse actually is now changing from, do we have enough food, to do we have more nutritious food? So when we talk about gene editing, then we are looking at the point where, like Michael mentioned, it's going to complement these other technologies or these other practices that is being used for indigenous technology. For example, if you're growing a gene edited seed, you're definitely going to need to plant cover crops or to rotate your crops, or to make sure that all other agronomic practices that you need to use to make sure that the soil is healthy is also applied in the gene edited seeds. That said, I would also want to bring up the point that in animal agriculture, there are so many other diseases that is affecting animals. For example, we have the trypanosomiasis that is affecting cattle, and this is a big problem in so many parts of Africa. And there is this potential to, edit the gene of cattle to make it resistant to this disease, and that could actually improve the meat content for some of these things. So while there are countries where there are people who are happy about the fact that we produce enough food, they produce enough food, and the point is not that there is not enough food, I agree, but the point also is that there are so many places in different parts of the world who do not have enough, and we need to create access to most of these tools that they need to make sure that they use a holistic approach to produce enough food to feed themselves. In addition to that, so many consumers in the US are looking for more nutritious and safe options. For example, a lot of consumers are interested in gluten-free wheat or they are making healthy choices, more nutritious tomatoes, more tasty tomatoes. I know there is a research by Pairwise to produce kale that is better testing and Brussels sprouts that is better testing. Consumers are now looking for some of these nutritious options, and those options should be made available to them. Gene editing technology offers that promise to produce those better testing options. So while we are talking about, having enough, we could also consider people that don't have enough and the fact that they need access to these tools to be able to produce enough.
If I could just intervene here just very quickly, I want to support what Modesta and Chris are just saying there, because part of the challenge is because we produce so much corn in the United States and we dump it on other markets, just to build on one of Chris's points, that undermines small farmers in a lot of countries, right? It destroys markets. So they don't produce anymore. Just a quick story, I was doing research on rice production in northern Ghana back in 2008. While I was there studying this new effort to get farmers to grow more rice, the president of Ghana announces that he's going to reduce tariffs on rice imports, which basically undercut these small farmers in northern Ghana. The markets are going to disappear because of that. So why should they produce something when they don't have anywhere to sell it? So yeah, if our focus was on food production, I think we would have a different model than we have right now. I'll shut up for now.
Thanks, Leland. Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, there's a lot. This has been a rich discussion. I think that it just exposes how complex this is, because really what we're talking about here is a food system that nobody says is really on the right track. It's been developed over time to be something that we think doesn't serve us well, and doesn't serve us nutritionally, leaves a lot of issues unattended, creates inequities. And I think, just with that backdrop, I think there's been a lot of commentary about that. The question is what to do about it. What to do about a U.S. corn belt that's 90 million acres. It isn't going away. What to do about the fact that, over the next generation, the experts, at least that I follow, suggest that growth in food demand is going to drive 400 million hectares of conversion of native habitats to agriculture to meet growing food demand. That's a problem. It's just a huge problem that we have. And so the complexity of working on those solutions, I think, demands that we acknowledge that we have a huge challenge, a huge generational challenge here, to think about where and how can technology be part of that solution, and where do we need to put safeguards and push back and look at other forms of innovation to meet those needs. So this is just a hugely complex issue, and I guess that's where I would leave it. Is I don't have answers to those issues, but I feel like it demands our attention, and I think that's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, and you are hitting on a little bit, Michael, a question that came in from the chat. For the scientists, whether public or private sector, or even at the level of universities and companies, working on gene editing and trying to decide how to apply the broader discussion of systems issues to their own work. What is the advice that you all have? What can and should they do? I think would love to hear from each of you, or those who want to respond to that.
I can jump in. I would first of all like to see universities take a much more aggressive stand on public goods research and less focus on pursuing intellectual property protections so that they can get some profits. Now, I understand the dilemma that universities are in. In 1972, 78% of university research budgets came from the federal government. The most recent data shows we're under 50%, right? So universities have to generate their research budgets somehow. If it's not coming from the federal government, then it's going to come from the private sector or from their own research agendas. But I still have to say that universities need to make a stronger stand to say that public goods research, and to a certain extent what we're talking about here, that we should be solving the problems of the agricultural system. Broadly, I think Michael explained that well here. This system doesn't seem to be working. Well, what kind of system should we have? And I think universities can be a real center of discussion about this. And then perhaps we can filter that up to policymakers who might be able to take a different approach to, that we don't solve problems by underfunding research, we solve it by investing in research. And I think gene editing can become one of those solutions if we actually invest in it more broadly than just trying to fix something by twisting a gene somehow. And that's the real challenge. But I have to say that I think debates like this are the way to elevate the discussion too. It's got to start somewhere.
Others want to respond?
Well, the one.
Yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. I'll just echo what Leland said and add that gene editing offers this level playing field for the academics, the private companies, the public research to improve crops that could actually help subsistence farms. And yeah, I just wanted to echo that.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, good. I didn't want to step on it. We live in this virtual world now where, it's hard to manage in some of these panel discussions. But in the category of an idea that isn't very well developed and will need a lot of work to have any merit, I would submit one idea, which is, back to this issue of trust. All the research that I've seen, try to summarize a vast amount of research in one thing, is that one of the pathways to trust with society is to have independent scientists who are truly outside of any conflict of interest, do independent research on these issues and publish and have the right to inform the public. And I think that's where our university system could be called upon to do a lot more. So let's just step back and say, look, maybe gene editing has some application. Maybe it has some benefits. We know it's going to have some unintended consequences and some risks, so it needs to be regulated. But the question is, how will we determine if there's really benefits? Do we want to rely on the technology developers? Do we want to rely on the traditional messengers to the public? Or is there an opportunity here for the land grant system or the university system to play a role and have the funding to be completely independent and publish independent research on these, both ex ante and ex post? And I think that would be a remarkable contribution to this issue of trust.
I agree with that, Michael.
Chris, did you want to add? Or are you just adjusting your screen?
I am the least qualified person here to talk about that. I think everybody here is probably more educated. So now, I mean, the only thing I'd say to a scientist is, having worked in an engineering background and having worked in tech, it's that old saying that when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I think gene editing can sometimes fall into that category, and it becomes important to remember that not all the problems are nails. Some of them definitely are, but to remember that to kind of back up and look at the entire agricultural system, because like Michael said, it is incredibly complicated. It is not just about can we produce enough food. It's about distribution. It's about politics. It's about business. It's about dumping. It's about war. It's about all kinds of things. Like food is this kind of Gordian knot of society and always has been. So it's never going to be a simple, single-faceted problem. And I think it's important for people working in gene editing, especially when you are like this close to it. I mean, literally looking at the insides of an organism, to remember to kind of back up and sometimes ask yourself, not just can you, but should you?
Thanks, Chris. Well, recognizing that we've just got a couple more minutes here, I want to ask this question about how will we know if societal benefits are being addressed or being considered, early on in product development, for example, or later on in terms of, when something is deployed and how it fits into that broader food system that we've been talking about. Are there markers? What information does society and do, those who are evaluating the benefits here, what do they need to know whether or not we're seeing benefit and whether or not this is worth it and fitting into, making for better change? And I'll just let you all respond as you'd like.
I'll jump in, I guess. We could, following Michael's point, we could invest in research that could document whether things are having a particular impact. Now, to make a reference back to genetic engineering, and much of the research that was done on the social impacts on that was almost exclusively economic. So did farmers benefit economically from planting BT? There was some elements on environmental impacts, like something like, there was a little less pesticide sprayed on BT crops, but turns out there was more herbicide sprayed on glyphosate-resistant crops. And so, there was a little bit of the environmental impacts. But for the most part, we've only been thinking about these things in terms of economics. We simply need to broaden our idea of what it means to benefit socially from these technologies. And a lot of that has to do with opening it up and having a more democratic participation about what is it that people want out of their food system. And I think that's one of the disappointing things about, using the term like gene editing is more democratic. I'm still not exactly sure what democratic means here. I think it means that it's more accessible to more people because it's a little bit cheaper and easier to use than some of the traditional gene editing things. But it certainly doesn't mean involving more public participation in what is it that we expect out of our food system. And, I think even to the contrary, it's that this is going to be good for you, you should take it. We need a more democratic process for determining what it is we want, in the United States and abroad. So that's what I would say.
And as we begin to wrap up here, I'm just wondering if anybody has any final words they'd like to respond to that, or anything else you'd like to leave us with as we wind it up.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly add that measuring societal benefits could be based around the concerns about food security, from lack of access to access. So if farmers who initially did not have access to these tools eventually had, get access to them, and they could be able to weigh in the differences between their productivity without and with, that could be like an easy way to understand how the society is benefiting in this. And again, when we talk about nutrition, it's a big deal here in the US. And with this tool that has so many potentials for improving nutrition, I'm sure that if consumers will get access to foods that are better tasting and more nutritious, and that would be one way to measure it, aside the fact that we also need to weigh in the economic impact and the other production cost that is being reduced through using them.
Thanks, Modesta. Michael,
just the one last thing I would just say is I feel like Chris put his finger on the issue in the very early part of this conversation, which is we have to solve for trust. And too often we focus on the science alone and let the science kind of take us where it will. And we found out the hard way on climate change that just because we have consensus science that shows that it's a real issue and it demands urgent attention, that doesn't necessarily win over the hearts and minds of people to act and to change anything. And so I think there needs to be really just as much attention to the question of hearts and minds and societal engagement as there is around the fundamental science of gene editing. And so, to me, I think that's what I take away from the conversation today.
Thanks, Michael. Chris, any final thoughts?
Not a lot, honestly. I just, I'm just very encouraged by this conversation where people who are on, frankly, I think probably polar opposite ideas of what gene editing is and what it can do and what the risks are can just have a civilized conversation about the problem. I think it goes a long way. I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes in the future. I really like the idea of measuring success and kind of putting metrics around things other than economic benefit. That's something that I've talked with the developers of Tom Turkit in Thailand, who develop an agricultural co-op that literally defines profit to their shareholders as like 30 or 40 different things, of which money is one and is maybe in the middle in terms of importance. And I think it's great that if we are going to evaluate what engineering's potential is, that we use a much more sophisticated model than just who made money.
I would add one more thing to that, Chris, yield. Not just money and not just yield. There's more to food than yield. Yeah.
Great. Well, I hate to have to bring this to a close because I have so enjoyed this, and I think we at Keystone think that this is certainly a needed conversation. We wouldn't be hosting CRISPRCon, and just deep gratitude to you all as panelists today. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Modesta and Leland. It's truly been a pleasure for me to explore these issues with you, and I hope that the conversation doesn't end here, although we have to close it for now. So we are going to begin removing you all from the stage now, and I'll make a few closing remarks before we totally wrap up. But thank you again. All right. Well, again, thanks to our panelists, and thank you to those of you who have joined us as participants. Thank you to our sponsors and to all of our CRISPRCon advisors. You can find them listed at CRISPRCon.org. And today's panel session will be available on our YouTube channel and our website within 24 hours from now, if you'd like to revisit it or share with other people. And I just want to share a few quick reminders. I know we're at the bottom of the hour here. Our next panel discussion will be Tuesday, October 13th at 10:30 in the morning Eastern Time. For that session, we're partnering with the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University to consider how social equity factors into non-human gene editing. First, exploring how risks are defined and governed in food systems, and then exploring potential risks and benefits for climate justice, picking up some of the threads from discussion today related to societal risk and benefits of gene editing. Today, after today's panel discussion, there will be an ideas marketplace offering participant-led small group discussions on various topics to our week's theme of hope and hype. So we encourage all participants to join one of those small group discussions, and those will begin after the panel today and run until about 1:15 Eastern. So at this point, I'll conclude our live content for today, but you're all invited to explore the other areas of the conference, which remain open until 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And you can meet your fellow attendees through the People tab or use the networking feature in Hopin to have a virtual coffee break, conversations with other participants. And the expo is also available. That includes background information on what is CRISPR, information about our partners and sponsors, and links to past CRISPRCon content related to the theme of hope and hype. And you can also continue the dialogue on Twitter at #CRISPRCon2020. And please be sure to register for future CRISPRCon 2020 virtual events coming up now through the rest of the month. So thank you again to everyone who participated today, and please carry on the conversation.